Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Asai Calderon Muñiz.
So, we're going to be talking about the one thing that everyone needs to know, and that's how do I make the perfect creme brulee? No, it's actually going to be a study plan. So, this is something that is so incredibly important, not just for the MCAT, for life in general. We need to know how to plan things. And I am a huge planner. I don't know about you, Phil. If they had a planner that were like an actual planner that were just mobile, but you could fold it up and then fold it in, like unfold it into something big, I would be that person constantly like folding, unfolding, folding, unfolding. And this is something that's so important for the MCAT, and it's being strategic, right? Because the MCAT at the end of the day is all about strategy. You need to know not just the content, you got to know how to use it. You got to know when to do what. And that's what we're here to talk about. And it's one of my biggest sources of excitement, along with baking, in case no one has picked that up just yet. If you have any tips, Phil, for something to bake that requires minimal strategy, I'd be open for that too.
Yeah. No, you're probably not going to get a lot of that from me. I do, like, I have seen your schedule, Azai, when we like try to like schedule things in meetings, and you are the planning queen. I will admit I am a much more go with the flow, or at least I used to be. So all of a sudden there's so much stuff going on that like, okay, I got to get organized just so that I can survive the day. And, but that's as far as I go. And so I think it's really important to understand planning kind of from both of those perspectives, because our students are in both of those scenarios, right? Like different students, like some students may love planning, some students may hate it. I will say the MCAT is big enough and complex enough that I don't think you can make it through it successfully without having a good plan.
Nope.
I know we talked a lot in a recent podcast episode about motivation and preventing burnout, and about how the MCAT is a marathon and not a sprint. Mm-hmm. And that should be reflected in your study schedule. It should be reflected in your plan. And so there are a lot of things to think about here. And here's what makes this difficult. You guys are all different. Some of you guys may be going to school full-time with a full-time job and a lot of family requirements, and you don't have 20, 30, 40 hours a week to spend on studying. Some of you guys might be like on like a break from school and like, I'm just doing MCAT and that's it. And like, obviously those two study schedules need to be different. And so we are going to kind of talk like big picture a little bit about what things to be thinking about as you're creating your study schedule. It's also a difference, like if your test is in 8 months or your test is in 3, right? Like that's a big difference in the way that you should be studying and prepping for that. Is obviously not going to be the exact same schedule. But there are some phases of your schedule that need to be like considered no matter what your schedule looks like. We're going to spend some time talking about that for sure today, and that should help everyone.
Yeah, and I just want to preface all of what we're going to talk about by saying that we're going to touch on some overarching, components, like you said, Phil, but the same with free trial sessions. This comes up all the time. Students say, okay, what about my individual exact situation? And it's really hard for us to do that, which is where our academic advisors come into play. In case you haven't heard us talk about them already, they are fantastic individuals who can help you sort out what your MCAT, but also application progress and cycle can potentially look like, and connect you with the resources to make that happen. So on to the fun stuff. So the very first thing that I think students need to figure out is when they're going to do what, right? But that, like you said, depends on how much time they have available to them. And so it's helpful to say, okay, when is my goal to test? How much time would I need to study for, right? And how much time do I reasonably have? Because you can sit down and you can be like me and you can try and color code your planner to the high heavens. But if you don't know how much time you have, how much time you need, without those two things, you don't have anywhere to start. Right.
Yeah.
And so
that's That's a big thing. I feel like a lot of times people will come to me with a plan that like, this is unrealistic.
Exactly.
Right? They're like, I want to study 60 hours a week, or like they'll say, I want to study 20 hours a week and I want to be ready in 2 months. I'm like, well, that's not going to work, because understanding how much time you have, like either that needs to go way up or your time frame needs to go way up, or you just need to be okay with not getting the score that you want. And so there's multiple things kind of at play here. I think a good place to start for students is, generally speaking, with some wiggle room, most students take or spend about 300 hours to properly prepare for the MCAT. Now, some students do more than that. Some students do less than that. Some students do really well. Some need some help. And so that is a general, just a place to start. Plan for, okay, about 300 hours. So if you've only got 20 hours a week that you can do, then that should be 15 weeks going in, which is pretty close to 4 months. There's a lot of students that study for the MCAT for 3 or 4 months. Most of those students wish they had more time. I've had students be successful with 6 months. I've had students successful and they spent 1.5 years, and those students did really well if they really stuck to a plan and had a good way to approach this. But figuring out how much time you can actually put in, I think that's, in a lot of ways, that's more important. A lot of times students start with the date and I'm taking the test this day. They're not thinking about their schedule and what they can actually do. I hear this all the time because I think there's a lot of stuff out there saying you have to take the test in May or earlier in order to apply in June. I would rather have a student take the test in August when they are prepared than take it in June when they're unprepared. And you can, I have students who've taken the test in August and gotten in. I have students who've taken the test in May and didn't get in. So the date should not be the most important factor. It's do you have enough time to prepare the way that you want to?
Yeah. And I think, honestly, this issue of timing is also one of the reasons that people may not like planning, because it can feel overwhelming and trying to figure out, okay, how much time do I need to set aside for something? Or it makes how much time we actually have a reality. And that can be very stress inducing. And so I think one of the best ways to start this, because we want to be as actionable as possible, is sit down, make a list of, and again, not everyone is going to have this come out the same way or necessarily create this list the same way. But what are the general responsibilities that I have every week, right? And how much of that time is left over without assigning every single second to studying? Because we've talked about this before. We talked about it in that episode, avoiding burnout. You don't want to get burnt out. You don't want every single second to be consumed by MCAT studying, because you're going to neglect other parts of yourself. You're going to get burnt out. It's not conducive to a months-long process of studying. And so once you've sat down and you've actually been realistic about that time, then we can start thinking, like you said, that roughly 300 hours, recognizing that if you've been out of school for a while, it's going to take you longer, right? If you are not comfortable or you didn't really learn the content when you were first going through it, you're going to have to put more effort into the content now, right? And so that first part of your studying phase is going to be longer. And so recognizing and writing, either writing those things out, coming up with them in your head, but being very honest with yourself is going to make, whether you like planning or you don't like planning, the planning process easier. And that's going to be really important to making it sustainable and flexible as well.
Yeah. I think that 20 hours a week is a good place for a lot of students to start, especially if you're in classes and have jobs and things like that. Say Monday through Thursday, I'm going to spend 3 hours a day working on MCAT stuff. And then also on Saturday, I'll put in 8 hours on that. And that's still a pretty hefty schedule, right? You're giving up one of your weekend days to work on that. I do think you always want to have a day off every week. You need a guaranteed day off, but that would get you 20 hours, right? 3 days or 3 hours a day, Monday through Thursday, and then 8 hours on the weekend. You could also just do 4 hours, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then 4 hours on Saturday. And that makes your weekend a little bit freer. But you need to have an idea of what you can do, and then take that and then figure out, okay, if I do this, how far away can my test be? And I can still get in somewhere around 300 hours. And I think that is a much healthier way than trying to work in the other direction, where you pick your date and then just realize, oh, I need to study 47 hours a week, right? Like, okay, that's not going to work, right? Unless that's all you're doing every week.
Yeah. And I think something else that is, and there will be times where it is helpful to work backwards, like when you're planning exams, but that's a very niche instance, right? One thing that you also want to make sure that you're doing is try and be consistent in what days you are studying and taking off as much as possible, because that consistency is going to make it easier to have a schedule that you can stick with. When you constantly have everything moving, it can feel a lot more stressful. And that's where it might feel more comfortable for folks who are go with the flow. But it can also be, if we're not careful about it, it can work against us. Same with the folks who really like planning. If you don't allow for that flexibility, right, it can work against us. And so when you have consistency and a bit of wiggle room, that allows life to happen, right, which will inevitably happen, but allows us to have some semblance of, okay, I can get back on track, right? And so if you're consistently, let's say, choosing Fridays as your day off because you don't have any classes either, and it's truly a day off for you, right? Don't all of a sudden start leaving, not doing anything Thursdays and then using Fridays to catch up. So having that consistency in your schedule will be helpful to hold you accountable, to make it more manageable, and to make it less daunting to both plan and execute.
Yeah. It also keeps motivation higher.
Yes.
Just generally, because there's a theory of motivation that has a lot of good evidence behind it with like studies that people only are able to like keep up motivation for so much throughout the day. It's almost like they have a certain amount of motivation points for the day. And that's why people tend to be more motivated earlier in the day, because at the end of the day, you've kind of spent those points. And if you have to spend some of your motivation points just figuring out when am I going to study today, then that means that like you just have less motivation, right? Mm-hmm. And if you start off the day not knowing when you're going to study, and like you go through your entire day and you go through all of this and you have like a window at the end of the day, like you're kind of like, oh, I kind of just want to watch TV and chill out. Like you've kind of spent your motivation points versus if you just block it out, like it doesn't take any inertia or activation energy to do this because it's already planned, right? This is just, This is always the plan is this time I go do this thing. And like, it's easier mentally to go through that when everything is kind of scheduled out. Speaking as somebody who hates scheduling things out, it is much easier to stay motivated with things if you sit down and like have a schedule for that.
For sure. And
so,
I think,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And I think one last thing about this is asking yourself, like, will there be time that I can use to catch up if I need to? And that's where, we've talked about being flexible, but building in that flexibility is also going to be helpful. So for example, if you know that you've dedicated you've dedicated Monday through Thursday and then Saturday, right? And maybe your days off are Sunday or Friday. Maybe one of those other days can be flex time. And so you can account for the fact that you'll have flex time. You may not need it, in which case that would be fantastic. That's time that you can spend on other things. And it's just kind of like a little bonus and a reward if you get that flex time at the end of the week. But that can also be another way to make it easier to stick to a plan. So, you might say, okay, I met my goal this week, but I have some extra time in case I need it.
I really like that idea of like going back to the schedule that I proposed earlier. It's like 3 hours a day, Monday through Thursday, and then 8 hours on Saturday. Like maybe you should plan for 4 hours a day, Monday through Thursday, and then 8 hours on Saturday. But if you actually do the full 4 hours, Monday through Thursday, then you get to be done 4 hours earlier on the weekend. And like that sort of like motivation thing might make you keep going and push a little bit harder, which can be really useful. The other thing is, like you mentioned, like planning for ability to kind of go back. And that's a really important part of like the phases that you want to be thinking about as you're going through prep. And so I think we're going to split this up a little bit because Azai is the cars queen and I love the sciences. So like from the sciences perspective, there's a whole lot of stuff you got to learn. There's a whole lot of content. Even if you understood and memorized and you still remember everything from undergrad, there's still a lot of content you need to cover, stuff that is not on the, like, that is not in undergrad in your classes, but is still on the MCAT. So there's always going to be a content gap that you need to address. Now, a lot of times students want to start with a lot of exams and practice passages and things like that. The thing is, if you don't know what insulin is, like doing this passage on insulin, like it's not, like if you don't have the right context to be able to understand and interpret this, then doing that passage isn't going to help anything. If this is a passage about doing a lot of Western blots with insulin, like, and you don't know what a Western blot is, you don't know what insulin is, like there's no point in doing that passage because you can't learn how you're supposed to be approaching it because it just doesn't make sense. There's an issue there. And so that's why in the first phase of your prep should be much more focused on content, much less focused on applying that content, like passages and exams and things like that. So at the beginning, I always think a student should be spending like a lot of time just going through all the content. Now, this leads to multiple issues. So first off, like in undergrad, very often students, like they want to be able to like master everything before they move to the next step. And if you say, I'm not going to move to the next phase until I can lecture on every single content area, what's going to happen is you're never going to move to the next phase. And so we're going to talk about this later on, but you will still have time to go over content in later phases. But this first phase of like content phase is just, you're going to shotgun, like scatter, hit everything, right? And get like a little bit of background knowledge kind of across the board. Now, this phase is actually probably a bigger portion of your prep than you may realize. Like this is generally going to be somewhere between the first half and the first 2/3 of your prep. So for example, if you were taking the test in 4 months, I'm going to say you're going to spend the first 2.5 months in this content phase. And so you're going to spend the majority of your time in this phase. And that's just because there's so much content. There's so much stuff going on. I also think that this is one of the areas where it is easiest to lose motivation because it's kind of a grind where you just are like going through topic after topic, electrostatics, circuits, fluid dynamics, periodic trends, nephrology, endocrinology, right? And you just kind of like get a little bit kind of ground down by these things because it's just a constant influx of like drinking through the fire hose where it's just constant stuff coming at you. But I do want you to keep in mind that you do not need to master everything. You need to be able to recognize stuff. You need to be able to have a good background understanding of these things. There will be time later on to go back and work on your weak areas and like re-look at kidneys. I had to go back and look at kidneys again like 3 or 4 times because there's something about kidneys just didn't stick in my brain.
Renal's ridiculous.
Yeah. I don't know what it is about nephrology. Like I never wanted to be a nephrologist. Nephro and immuno were my least favorite things. And that had to be reflected in my study. I needed to spend more time on those topics because I just wasn't as interested in them, and that information didn't want to stick in my brain.
Yeah, and I think there's something else that, I've definitely heard you mention so many times, so I know we've talked about this so much. It's when you're thinking about the content, it's not just about what you feel, but it's also data driven. Right. And so in this content phase, when you're deciding, okay, what am I going to spend more time on? It's not just I didn't like this topic. It's I actually struggle with this topic, right? I am listening to the lecture and it's not that I don't like it. It's that, I need to slow down. I can't watch it on 2 speed, right? And I'm actually going to pay attention, I'm going to pay a different type of attention to it. It's also, if it's amino acids versus, right? Basically anything else. Exactly. Amino acids gets your time. When you were talking about, you don't move on until you master something. You better master amino acids.
Yeah.
You need to know what they look like, right? If you can draw them, beautiful, fantastic. That will make your life easier as well in the sense that it reinforces, right? You should know the 3-letter abbreviations, 1-letter abbreviations, the properties, etc. So amino acids, you got to master that. But like you were saying, right, it can feel really overwhelming. And with cars, people tend to do something that's interesting because all they get, are questions, right? And so similar to, our first kind of gut reaction for the sciences being, let me do something with it. For cars, it's like, let me do something. But people often don't realize, and students often don't realize that there's a method to the madness. You can prepare for cars. You don't have to jump in and wildly go about and hope for the best and hope that that arrow hits the target, right? There is a clear approach that you can take, and you can be systematic to take some of that subjectivity out of cars. And investing that time early on is going to be important. And I know we have some listeners that are in the course. This is why, we have all of our different lectures on the strategies first, and we front load that for you guys. For anyone who's come to the free trial session for cars, we've talked about this, and you've heard me talk about what I'm going to say next, but it's the importance of accuracy. And so that first phase for the sciences is really content phase. For the first phase for cars, we call it the accuracy phase. And this phase is primarily understanding the strategies that you're going to use, as well as beginning to apply them. And that means I'm not going to sit down and try and do a practice, section in one sitting. That is not a good use of my time. A better use of my time is being able to consistently, there's that word that keeps coming up across the entire MCAT, studying, planning, etc. When I'm able to consistently do well, then when I'm able to consistently apply the strategies, then right? Then what? Then I can do more practice. And so learning to step on that, like on those brakes with cars, I promise that actually wasn't an intended pun. But when you learn to step on the brakes, you're setting yourself up for success, not for failure. Speeding into it is going to be the problem. And we've definitely talked about this before. I like the car analogy, right? And I didn't realize that it was a pun until, I was talking about it out loud one day. But essentially, you're not, if your goal is to get to your friend's house, super quick, right? And you're driving and you want to be able to pick them up and get to class really quick, or whatever it may be, you guys want to go out. If you've never stepped foot in a car, or if you've never been behind the wheel of a car before, you would better not jump on that highway and start driving 70 miles an hour. You shouldn't be driving over the speed limit anyway, but whatever. But the point is, that's a quick way to get into an accident, right? And that can happen with the car section as well. The first thing you need to do is you need to get a lay of the land. You haven't been on this side of the car before, right? You haven't been behind the wheel before. So learn where everything is, right? Learn which pedal is the brake, which is the gas, right? Learn what direction the car moves in response to what you do to it, or what, you try and tell it to do. And so you're going to be doing the same thing with the car section. You're going to be focusing on that accuracy first, understanding the strategies, understanding how you think, and learning to be able to do that consistently.
Yeah, I love that analogy. Cars is ultimately very skill focused. It's not content focused. Like, you don't need to know anything about whatever the passage topic is about. But skills, they get better with practice. And your first step with any skill, just like driving a car, should be let me figure out how this thing works first, and let me get comfortable with it before I start worrying about timing and efficiency and things like that, like fuel mileage. Like the first time somebody gets into a car and is learning to drive at the age of 15 or 16 or whenever, you don't want them worried about getting the best fuel mileage, or what's the shortest path, or how to accelerate and decelerate and take inside corners because it cuts distance off. You just want them concerned with safety, right? Let me just figure out what's the right way to just do things. And then later on, you can start to worry about other things, right? And even taking that analogy farther, I feel like we want to be performance people when it comes to cars, right? So it's not just we're trying to figure out how to get in a car and drive to a friend's house. No, we want to be a Formula One driver, a NASCAR driver, right? You don't need to be concerned with all of those things at first. Just figure out how to drive a car first. And that's the way to approach this. Now, we're kind of talking about both these things, but I also want to reiterate, and I know I say this often, that we want to mix topics. Don't, in this content phase, don't say I'm going to do physics and then biology and then biochem and then psych and then sociology and then organic chemistry and then general chemistry. That is not a good way to do that, because you need to be blending these topics in your head, making connections between them. And so you should be doing some of each category. And just like you mentioned, Azai, like amino acids, super high yield. Like you should be guiding this time based on how high yield certain topics are. For example, biology and biochemistry. Those two areas are incredibly high yield. You take those like bio topics and you combine that with cars, that's over half of the exam, right? Like over half the questions are just those topics. You add in psychology, just psych, that's over 2/3 of the exam, which means the other third is physics, chemistry, organic chemistry, and sociology. So those 4 areas are just like 1/3 of the test. And orgo is really low yield. It's like 5% of the test. And so you don't want to be spending in this initial phase, you don't want to spend like twice as long on orgo as you do psychology. Psychology is way higher yield. You're going to see about 38 questions on test day versus 11 for orgo. I want to reiterate this. You have more questions in psych than you do physics and chemistry combined. So you should be spending more time in psych, more time in biochem, and cars. Though you should be spending more time in those areas because it's just worth more points. Now, I don't want you worried so much about like what it is that you feel like you're weaker at. And this is something like you mentioned, I don't want students to stop and say, I feel like I'm really bad at orgo because I struggle in orgo in undergrad, and so I'm going to spend a lot of time in orgo. This is not the time for that. This is a time of getting through all the content in an efficient way, realizing that we're going to have to come back and look at this again later. And that's just a way. I really wish that the human brain existed in such a way that I could read something once and memorize it forever. My life would have been so much better and more efficient. That is a superpower that I would pay for if I could just read something once and memorize it forever. And so built into this study plan needs to be room for, I need to go back and look at this again, right? I need to review this or re-review it again. And so this first phase is just, let's get through all the content. Let's start to work on the accuracy of our car stuff because there's no content for that. It's just skills. You want to start to develop those skills. And that should take you like at least halfway, if not more, into your prep. So if you're prepping for 4 months, first 2 months, and then some change, probably maybe a couple more weeks after that, still in this phase here before we start to move to the next phase.
I really quickly want to point out that these things should be happening at the same time in the sense of cars and science.
Yeah.
So sometimes students will overcorrect and do one of two things. Either they will put cars off until the last minute because they feel confident, and then they're like, oh, snap, it's cars. Mm-hmm. Or they'll get so focused on cars at the beginning that then they start neglecting the sciences. Neither should be the case. So yes, cars is the single highest yield topic on the exam because you get 53 questions on it. That's it, right? But it's not the entirety of the exam. And yes, cars can help you with the other sections, but at the same time, cars is also different from the other sections. The same way that you're going back and forth between different science content areas, you should be going back and forth with science and cars. Now, you should still be doing daily cars practice. That's why we have the daily cars passages released for free. And so you're going to be doing those from the beginning. So that's something else to keep in mind as you're getting ready to create your schedule of what your next couple of months studying for the MCAT will look like. I just really want to make sure that we say that explicitly because I know you and I think it all of the time. And we have so many conversations about this, but I want to make sure everyone who's listening knows the importance of those two things.
Yeah. So in like that given example I said, where it's like, Monday through Thursday, we're doing 3 hours. You should be doing cars for a portion of that every day. Now, it doesn't need to be like 2 hours of that, but like 30 minutes to an hour of that time needs to be spent on cars. Now, I don't think you need to do some of every topic every day. So like say on Monday, you're doing cars and then biology, and then on Tuesday it's cars and physics, and then cars and chemistry, and then cars and psych, right? And so mixing those things up is I think okay. If on the other hand you did say like, okay, I'm doing cars for an hour and then I'm doing like biochem for an hour and a half and then psych for an hour and a half after that, I think that makes sense also. So don't feel like it's got to be it, but I would stick to like 2, maybe 3 topics, one of them being cars in this scenario with like, the 3 hours Monday through Thursday. And so that's how I would want to structure this, and just kind of like working through the content, crossing through this as you go along, keeping track of the progress you're making because it will keep you motivated.
Yes.
But eventually you're going to hit this point where you have made it through the content and you're going to be like, that's it, I'm ready to take the test. And that is not true because the MCAT is a monster. I know I talk about this often, but there's a lot of stuff in undergrad that doesn't prepare you for the MCAT. In undergrad, if you memorize the stuff they give you, you should automatically like nail the test, right? They said, memorize these, and you memorize them, you show up, you do well. The MCAT likes to throw curveballs. They like to throw things at you where maybe there's like 2 or 3 ways to solve this question, but they're all kind of tricky, or it's forcing you to like connect 2 topics that normally you don't think to connect, or there's strategies for like using the answer choices against each other. And there's things with like math tips and tricks that you can do. And all these things are things that are a little bit more strategy focused. That's why in the course, like in the sciences, we go through a ton of content first before we start to add in some strategy on top of that. So there should be like there needs to be some time to work on strategy for the sciences. We've been working on strategy this whole time for cars. You need to start to fill this in with the sciences as well. And so this is when you should start doing, if you haven't started yet, the AAMC materials, the section bank, the Q packs, all of those materials that the AMC released. That's not necessarily exams, but they're things that are there to help you kind of work on like the strategy side of this. And I would say that in this area, like this might overlap a little bit. This might be a little bit of a spectrum where it's like the first 2 months in the 4-month plan. First 2 months is pure content. And then maybe there's a week or 2 as you're finishing up whatever last content you have, but you're also doing some passages and some like AAMC materials. But then eventually you want to kind of like transition to, I've gotten through my content, and you're in this pure application phase where you are testing your ability to apply all this information you brought in. And so you're going to be taking practice tests. You're going to be taking a lot of them, probably 1 a week. And so in this scenario where you have like first 2.5 months, and then 1.5 month for the later phase, this 1.5 month, you should be taking an exam a week. You take a test on, let's say, Saturday. You review it on Sunday. And then like that review should tell you, these are my weak areas. Data interpretation, timing, nephrology, for some reason it never sticks in my brain, immunology, maybe some like basic math skills. And I need to review units because there were several questions I missed that had problems with units. So you go through all this really heavy review, and it should take you longer to review the test than it takes you to take the test, especially at the beginning. So the first practice exam you take should take you like about 8 hours to take the test, should take you probably 12 to 16 hours to review it, if not more. And so it's a big chunk of time. So that reviewing on Sunday might spill over into Monday as well. And so you spend kind of 2 days reviewing this. You want to do the review and the exam really close together, though. If you wait too long, then you kind of don't remember what you were thinking when you saw this question. And you want to be able to kind of access, like, what was I thinking when I saw this question? So you know how to fix your approach. So you do that. You have a list of, these are all my weak areas. The next, like, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, you're just hitting your weak areas. That's it, right? Like whatever that exam said was your weak areas, you're working on that, whether that's data interpretation and you're doing more passages, or it's content and you just need to go look at kidneys and study kidneys, maybe watch some videos or do some readings or flashcards. And so you want to do that. And then Friday, you take the day off. And then on Saturday, you start over. And this process of like, this is where like you are still going to go back and hit content, but only the content that is hurting you on the exams, not the content that you feel like you're bad at, but the ones that measurably are affecting your scores. There's a lot of students that feel like they're bad at orgo and then they don't miss any orgo questions. And like, so they like, I want to spend another week studying orgo. I'm like, why? Like this is not hurting your score at all. You're missing a ton of biochem questions. Let's study that instead. And so using this sort of data-driven focus, what happens is like from week to week, you're identifying weak areas and you're fixing them. And so each week your score should be increasing a little bit. That being said, I know that this sounds crazy, but the actual MCAT exam is not long enough to test you on everything. Like, it's so weird that like 8 hours is not enough time, but like you might have an exam that just doesn't touch kidneys or magnetism. And so you might not know that that's a weak area until week 2 when you take that exam, and all of a sudden there's kidneys questions and you're like, oh my God, like I need to study kidneys. This is why it's also important to do multiple exams, because it's only through multiple exams can you cover and diagnose all of your weak areas. And so this later phase should be looking very different for different students, right? Like, yeah, Monday or like Saturday and Sunday's exam and then review and then review on Monday. But Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, if your problem's timing, that's a very different problem than somebody who needs to work on math skills or like endocrinology content or electrostatics or circuits. And so you need to have this time to adjust. And you need to build your schedule around this. Build time into your schedule to go work on weak areas. Like that is a like thing you need to design into this. And so that's probably, this is one of those areas that I think students neglect that, and they don't build in time for diagnosing and going and hitting their weak areas. But this is when most of the growth is going to occur. I know this is going to sound really scary, but in that first 2.5 months, you take a practice test, your score may not have gone up that much, but you need that content background before you can start to apply and diagnose and go into that. And so it's usually through exams like 2, 3, 4, 5 that you start to see the growth going through there, or at least that's the design of the plan.
Yeah, exactly. And I was so excited when you started talking about this, because this is exactly what I had in mind, in that a single exam isn't going to tell you everything, right? And so you want to make sure that you don't discount something just because you didn't see it on that exam or because it didn't come up as an issue on that exam. And we cannot stress the importance of multiple exam as practice. And this means practice as you would take it on test day. Not, oh, I've done all of the practice exams one section at a time, and then come test day, well, here's an 8-hour sitting and I'm toast because I have never sat for a full exam. No. On those days, for example, like Phil, you mentioned Saturdays, that Saturday you should be testing as though it were your test day. So you are waking up at test day time. You are in front of your computer for the full time of each section. You are taking your breaks as test day breaks. If you can manage to eat what you'll eat on test day, fantastic. I did that for my most recent exam. I made sure I had the same lunch every day leading up to the exam, just so that I would be accustomed to it. And so you want to minimize as many variables as possible come test day. And that's where this phase, like you're saying, it's so important. This application phase is a great area for growth. And again, consistency will make test day less scary. In terms of CARs, so there's not quite the distinct content versus application, because you're doing application the entire time. So the way that we split it up in CARs, and that you'll hear about us talk about it in the free trial sessions, but also go more in depth in the course, is this difference between application and endurance. So application, we said, was getting in the car, right? Getting to know the car, you can step on the gas pedal a little bit, play with the brakes, you might pull out of the driveway, but you're coming right back. And then the endurance phase is, okay, I know the basics. I can get around in a car, right? I can drive in the little organization or whatever they're called. I don't know what they're called in English. And then you're going to slowly start driving further distances. And that's that endurance phase. Once you know what you're doing, once you know the basics of how a vehicle works and how to make the vehicle move safely, then you can start driving for longer distances and in more complex areas, right? And maybe busier areas. And so the same thing is going to apply with cars. Once you have that consistency down and you're able to do things well and accurately, then you can start adding more passages at a time. And so students will freak out because they're like, I'm a month in and I'm still not there. So then we need to do what you're talking about doing the application phase for the sciences, it's figure out what's going wrong. Right. In the course, we have conversations on these, and, we have office hours and all that. But that's one of the questions I get the most as an instructor. It's, how do I know, like, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong is such a common question and such a powerful question. And in cars, that should be an early question, right? That's incredibly important. I also, and I love talking about this because it boggles my mind, but I think it also boggles students' minds a lot. So for the free trial sessions, we want to know kind of where you're at ahead of time. And so we email you guys to have an idea of where you guys are at before our free trial classes. And so one of the responses that I get the most in terms of student concerns for cars before they come to the workshop, or before they come, to the free trial class, is timing. And students are like, yeah, my issue is timing. Like, that's what I struggle with the most. And so when I tell them, you're not focusing on timing for that accuracy phase, you're not focusing on timing for that endurance phase, I'm sure there are people who want to just log off right then and there, because they're like, you're not listening to me. My issue is timing. But I'm going to tell you the same thing I tell all the students. And it's, if we gave you 24 hours, one sitting, to do we're talking about cars here, right? But this applies for the sciences too, to sit down and do the car section, would you get every single question correct? No, you wouldn't. The answer is no. As much as we may want to say yes, because if we sat down for 24 hours, we're still prone, if not more prone, to some of the errors that we might make. We'll overthink, right? Mm-hmm. We're going to start and look for, we're going to start saying why we like answers and talk ourselves into the wrong answers. We get to those 50-50 questions, and suddenly everything looks more tempting. And now we're not just stuck between two answers, but we're like, wait a second, but B was actually not that bad. Maybe B is the right answer. Like, oh, snap, now I'm stuck between three answers, right? We have a limited attention span. If you're already struggling with, your attention span in cars, extra time is not going to help you. And so very rarely is timing the true issue. And that's why we emphasize so much accuracy and endurance before any of that conversation comes up in cars. And I think that's where students immediately want to jump to, especially I think this also applies with the sciences. They want to jump to like, okay, I need to get this done as fast as possible. But if you don't have that content down, if you haven't practiced applying, right? Time to boot. That's not going to help you.
Yeah. It's something that is counterintuitive, right? Because the whole thing is like this timed exam. Going back to our analogy of like NASCAR sort of thing, like if you don't know how to drive a car and you're trying to become a NASCAR driver, like time is important, right? Like how quickly can I make it around that? But if you're not comfortable driving a car, then like you should not be worrying about timing. You should be worrying about getting comfortable driving a car. And that's what happens with skills is the more comfortable you get with a skill, the faster inherently you're going to be. I hate jumping around between lots of metaphors, but I always like this analogy of if anybody has seen Gordon Ramsay chop an onion, right? Like he doesn't like take the knife and like wave it up and down and like hit the onion. Like the way he chops an onion, like he's got the knife, but he's kind of gripping it by the blade, right? Like he's holding it by the blade, and the knife is always touching the cutting board. It never comes off the cutting board. It just rocks back and forth. And then his other hand has got like the onion in it, and he like curls his fingers. And so if you're listening to this and not watching this on YouTube, then this is going to be hard to describe. But like he's got the knife always touching the cutting board and always touching both of his hands, the hand that's grabbing it and the hand that's grabbing the onion. And it's always on there, and he just rocks it back and forth. If you wanted to learn to do that, like Gordon Ramsay can take an onion and then a second later it's exploded into confetti. Like if you ever watch it, it's magical. If you want to do that, the way you do that is go really slow and mimic his movements and get really comfortable with this. And after you've chopped 200 onions that way, you're going to be faster. You're going to pick up speed. So the more you do it, the faster you get, especially as you start to understand the movements, understand like and develop those skills. Same thing for cars, same thing for sciences. The better you get at it, like developing those skills, the faster you're going to become. But if you are trying to be fast and develop those skills at the same time, like if I am trying to chop an onion like Gordon Ramsay and I'm taking my knife and I'm trying to just go as fast as I can, I'm going to cut off my fingers, right? If I hop in a car, I've never driven a car. I'm going to try to beat a NASCAR speed, you're going to wreck the car, right? It's kind of the same thing in cars or on the MCAT, where you see like students who jump in and focus way too much on timing at first without developing the skills. Like it causes them to wreck, right? Like they just kind of end up not developing the skills, and like it just pushes everything farther back. So it's a super important part of this is developing that timing.
And I also want to emphasize, like, it's not just, and we've talked about it in this context of like, okay, accuracy first, right? Timing later. But that also applies with the endurance phase that we call in cars, right? Because like just continuing this same analogy, if the goal is to drive for an hour and a half and drive quickly, right? And this is like talking again about our friend or something like that, because at the end of the day, it's not just, let's say you have to go the 7 laps, right? But you're only comfortable doing 1 lap at a time right now. And then you want to try and do all 7 and as fast as you can at the same time, it's that same idea. You're still going to crash, right? So you have to be patient with yourself and recognize that part of how you become really good at something is giving each area the space that it needs to build off of the last one. So we talked about it mostly in terms of accuracy versus timing for cars, but that applies for the endurance phase as well. I don't know if we've explicitly said this or not yet, but because my brain is always in a bajillion places and bajillion different things at once, but in case we haven't already, so you mentioned that we're going to do an exam every week. This is the time where you plan backwards, right? In the sense that most recent exam that was released, most recent exam, or the exam you do closest to testing, and then you work your way backwards. But you want to make sure that you schedule them approximately a week out. You're not doing 2 practice exams at a time. So this is where, we said at the beginning, don't plan backwards, plan forwards. This is where you're going to plan backwards. Or you're going to fill in your schedule backwards and fill in your planner backwards with the exams.
I do think that pretty much every student, no matter what the scenario is, you need to spend the last chunk of your time doing about an exam a week.
Yes.
The quickest I would condense that is maybe once every 5 days. But even then, I'm not super happy and comfortable with that. That's something I would accept for 1 or 2% of students out there. Like students who just have 2 months because of this weird program they're in, and they don't have an option to push to a later date, like they're kicked out of their program if otherwise. Like, okay, those scenarios, we can start to kind of crunch this. I think that every student probably needs at least 5 exams. I will say I noticed like some diminishing returns after like 6, 7, 8 exams. Like students who take 15 exams, like you generally don't need to take 15 exams. Scores, if students are taking 15 exams, what's often happening is they're not reviewing properly, they're not diagnosing, and they're just doing tons of exams, right? But they're not actually working on developing skills and content and putting all of that together. So if you like go ahead and kind of plan this and you're like, okay, I've got like about 4 months is what I want to do, or 15 weeks, right? Plan for 5 of those weeks are exams, right? Where you're working through the exams. If your plan is a little bit bigger and you have like 6 months or 7 months, then all of a sudden, I think I would start to add in some more exams, right? I would start to add in, instead of doing 5, let's do 7 or 8 exams going into that. I think everyone needs at least 5 weeks of just working on this. But if you have more time, expanding that a little bit, I think is not the end of the world. You did also mention endurance, and I do just want to kind of point out to students that's not automatically an easy thing. It's hard to stay in the zone for 8 hours, right? And not let your mind drift and think about different things, which is why one of the very first exams you take, I'm just automatically like in the back of my mind saying, whatever score you got in psych on this exam, you're probably better than that score. Or your ability is probably higher than that score reflects. But just because psych is at the end of the exam, the first time a student takes a full-length exam, they're fried by the end of that exam because it's hard to build up that endurance. But this is why like we're taking like a full 5 weeks, right? Like over a month, we're spending working on endurance, working on application, working on data interpretation, some of those skills, the more exams you take, the easier it will get. But that is something that we do need to kind of like build into that. So that's something that's also built into this plan. And that's also why I know you mentioned this, it's really critically important not to break those exams into chunks, right? Say I'm going to do Chem Phys this day, and then Cars the next day, and then Bio, and then Psych Soc, and that's my Monday through Thursday, right? Like that is not helping you work on that endurance. And that is a very important skill to develop. Build up those mental calluses so you can kind of like keep going on test day and you don't get completely fried. I had a student once, I told him this, but then like he took multiple exams, and then he took like his fourth exam, and the score was really deflated in Bio and Psych, the later ones in there. And I'm like, what happened here? He's like, oh, I was just super tired. This is the first time I like did all the exam all the way through. And I just like threw up my hands like, no, like this is something you're supposed to be doing with every single exam. He's like, yeah, I know, but my schedule's a little like, okay, well, we got to figure out a way to change your schedule because like you cannot prepare for the exam without sitting for full length exams. And so I will say, I understand that is hard to do. It is hard to find an unbroken 8-hour period for a student. Like, it's not like you can take an exam over your lunch break, right? Yeah. So this is something also that you need to be aware of with your study schedule, right? Especially in that like last month and a half, 2 months, you need to plan for, I need every week, one day just completely to the MCAT without other stuff going on with it, because that's something that you have to build into this plan.
Yeah, and there is one caveat to what Phil and I just said about taking a full exam in one day. If you have accommodations, test with your accommodations in mind. So if your exam is split into 2 days because you're getting extra time, test in 2 days. Do not try and cram it all at once. That said, if you are hoping for accommodations, but they have not been given to you yet, test regular, meaning test the way you will, assuming that you don't have accommodations, how you would be expected to test, because the accommodations process is long. It can be annoying. They may have you resubmit information, right? You may not get it the first time, right? You may think that you qualify, and then they want more information from more physicians, more providers, etc. So you should not be assuming that you will get accommodations until you have gotten accommodations. Yeah.
That's really important. The journey to start getting your accommodations starts day one of that 4-month period. If that's your study schedule, it's like you are working on that in your content phase. And so you should know by the time you get to that later on phase when you're applying stuff more, you should know by then whether or not you're going to be able to get accommodations. It is very hard sometimes. It's harder than it should be to get accommodations at times. I've had a student have to apply 3 times for accommodations before finally they got it. And so I'm really glad you brought that up, because you, just as a side note, if you want accommodations or you're trying to get accommodations, don't be like, oh, I got it all the time in undergrad, so I'm definitely going to get it on the MCAT. No, it is not always that same process.
And it will sometimes be different accommodations. They have extended time, which I think is what most people are used to in undergrad, but they also have what are called stop the clock breaks. And so those are different. That is not adding extra time to your testing time, to the time that you are in front of the questions. And so the way that you approach that is going to be different. So make sure, and if you already have accommodations and you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I make use of them? I think we talked about them at the beginning. The academic advisors are fantastic folks who can help orient you as to how to make use of what you have available to you while you are studying for the exam. And among that would be, if you've gotten accommodations. But we just want to be very clear about that, because it's important. And I have seen students get bitten in the bum about that, regarding that in the past, because we don't say these things to make anyone's life more difficult, right? We don't get anything out of making your life more difficult at all. We say these things because that's what personal experience and years of experience has taught us. And so we want to make sure that you are set up for success as much as possible. So that's something to keep in mind when you're doing these practice exams. But there's so much that goes into creating a plan, which is why we've done this this full podcast. But I think sitting down and actually doing it, once you get started and once you get over that initial, a discomfort, can actually be really empowering, because then you have a game plan in front of you. And like you said, Phil, that kind of crossing off feels great. That having something in front of you that is flexible, is consistent, is manageable, and is going to get you to where you need to go. That's what's ultimately going to be the perfect MCAT, schedule for you as an individual. So you've got to take all of these things into account when you're creating it.